Hi, so I thought I'd share with you today a little bit about sewing some long strips together. So I've already joined some strips here, just to give you a bit of an idea. Sometimes when we sew long strips together, things get a little bit wonky or a little bit out of hand, and so I just thought I'd just give you some a couple of tips, I guess, on how that you can prevent some of the little problems that might happen. Now, when you're sewing strips together, the machine's going to feed them in, and it's got the little feed teeth, and it's going to feed things through at its own pace. On a regular machine that doesn't have a walking foot or a dual feed, it's feeding from the underneath with the little feed teeth. So the top is allowed to slide through, but the bottom is actually feeding. So sometimes you get a little bit of slippage happening, which isn't helpful because it means that seams go a little bit out of kilter. So if you have a dual feed on your machine, that is really handy to use for most of your piecing, and particularly long piecing. If you have a walking foot and not a dual feed, that's another option. If you don't have either of those things, I'll show you in a minute. But I'll just give you an example here. So I've got a couple of strips here that have been sewn. This one didn't use a dual feed, and when I just let it relax onto the board here, you might be able to see, because of the lines on the board, that in actual fact when it's sitting nice and flat here, it just starts curving around a little bit. Now this is not dramatic, and probably with an iron, particularly some steam pressing, you could probably manage with that piece fine. This one here with the narrower strips has been stitched, and when I let that one relax, you can see that that's curved quite a bit. So if I try and straighten that with a line on the board, it doesn't particularly want to, and then it starts getting quite bubbly here. Well, that's not a helpful thing. And I also know that when I started joining these strips, I started at this end, I came all the way down, I didn't use any sort of dual feed or any sort of assistance, I just let the machine sew it. And this blue strip was actually longer, this blue strip, the dotty one, was longer than this other blue strip. And now, by the end of the seam, it's round the other way. So this is not a good thing. It means there's too much of one fabric gone in there, which is causing this shaping to happen. So probably a little bit more than you want to have happen. It would be harder to press this one out. You're going to get things just a little bit wonky. So I just thought I'd show you a couple of the possible problems so that we can achieve a nice straight seam, something like this, hopefully. I've got two strips here. Now, one of the reasons you might want to do long strips, just before we go any further, is you might be wanting to slice them to make blocks. Maybe even something like this block here would be one that you could have a strip of a narrow with a wide in the middle, and you might slice them to get your parts of your block, and then in reverse for the center part. Or you might be joining long strips for bindings. You might be going to do some mitering. There's any number of reasons why you might want to join long strips. So it's just one of those little handy things. So I've got two strips here that I'm going to join. Now you can see these two strips are just with their selvages still on. When I lay them, one of them is just a fraction longer than the other. So I would recommend, to make sure that things are feeding correctly, that you start off with strips the same length. So I will trim those to the same length. So if you were doing something that was a specific length, you might trim to that size, or you might have them a bit longer so that you could trim afterwards. But either way, I would have them the same length, whatever that length is. And that will help a little bit with how things go through. So we can start at this end. Now, in order to keep things the same length and evenly fed through the machine, I would suggest using some of the little clips, or you might prefer pins. Pins and I are not friends, so I often use clips. I would put some at the beginning, so have your raw edges even. And I'd put one at the other end, again with all the raw edges even. And then I would find the center point, and I'd put another one there. And that's the very least I would do. There's every chance I would do a little bit more than that. I might go one in between, so you're kind of quarter pointing. So again, match up more or less the centers. This doesn't have to be absolutely exact, but it's so that you've got something holding the fabrics in between, so that you're keeping those edges nicely together and the same length in each segment. So we'll just pop a little clip in here. So keeping everything nice and level. It's worth getting these things right, because in your blocks, your borders, whatever it is, it's very nice to have things that just sit nicely. So if you take a little bit of time with the preparation, in general, that's going to happen. So I'm going to go to the sewing machine. Now this sewing machine does have a dual feed, so I'm going to start off using the dual feed. So what the dual feed does, it acts a little bit like the teeth underneath, and it helps feed through from the top. So we should get a nice even flow of how that's going through, and then part way through I'll take the dual feed off so that you can see the difference of how it feeds. So this is not meant to tell you that you have to have a dual feed, it's so that I can show you how to manage if you don't have one. So we're just going to go onto my fabric strip here. So I'm doing a 1/4 inch seam, and I'm just going to let the machine feed that through, and it's feeding through as you would expect, nicely, evenly. I'm coming up to the first little clip. There's no sign of any movement, it's not bunching or any of those sorts of things. So I'm going to take that dual feed off now. So that's just a little clip on the back of this machine, and other than that I haven't made any other changes, and I'm going to sew now, and I'm just going to let the machine feed itself through so that you can see whether it's making any difference or not. I'm not putting any pressure on, but what I am seeing is a little bubble starting to occur on that top fabric, and it's wanting to move across a little bit. So this is not helpful. So I'm going to, in the next segment, I'm going to show you how we can compensate for that. So we'll get here. I'm fairly flat here now, miraculously. So if it's going to do that on your machine and you want to know how to deal with that, I would be holding it that, and one of the reasons for things like the pins and clips is that you've got a little point to hold from, and I'm going to hold it back and front. Now I'm not adding any particular pressure, I'm not trying to pull the fabric through, I'm just holding it, still letting the machine do the feeding, but by holding it, it's allowing it to just feed more evenly. So you're almost, but not quite, putting some tension on the bottom fabric so that as the top one wants to bunch a little bit, the bottom one is just holding enough to allow the top one to ease through nicely. So I'll do that. So I'm holding back and front. I don't know if you can see all that, hopefully you can. And I'm just going to let that sew. So I'm not pulling it, I'm just allowing it and applying just a small amount of tension on the actual fabric. And that's feeding through beautifully now. No bunching happening. So it was really just to show you how you can feed the fabric through your machine, particularly on longer pieces when you're adding borders, anything like that, that you do this sort of pinning marking, that you cut to a length, make it fit, rather than just trusting that it's going to fit, because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it moves. There, you see that's coming through beautifully now. And again, just even that last bit, I'm just holding it, holding, not pulling. So we've done that. We had a little patch in here, and even just laying this piece down, you can see that this is sitting nice and flat. It's sitting quite straight along the lines here. This was the last bit that I've just stitched. This little wonky bit in the middle that I allowed to have its own little way has just started curving and wrinkling a little bit. The first bit here, where I had the dual feed on, that is also sitting flat. So this effect here is the same as this effect here. This one here may occur and will cause you some sort of problems at times. So I just thought I'd go through that, show you how you can sew long strips together without having too many problems. So it's kind of ready for pressing and whatever it is that you're going to do with it now, but it was all about the stitching. So thank you.